Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this latest in our now weekly Innovation at Work webinar series. Today, addressing the question of COVID and climate change and lessons learned so far. I wanted to just, but first of all, start by saying I think you all know that since this crisis began a few months ago, we really moved to this weekly format of Innovation at Work webinars, and we really wanted to bring it higher frequency, but also a short format, because we know how busy we all are and how zoomed out we all are with these kind of virtual meetings. So that said, I would like to introduce our speaker today, John Sterman, who is a professor at the MIT Sloan School, who really is one of our most active executive education instructors and a very active researcher and teacher at MIT. And relevant to today's discussion, John is very influential and sought after for his insights and advice in the areas of climate change by policymakers the world over. So we're very grateful, John, for you today, for spending some time with us. And the format today is not going to be a presentation, but a discussion. So we have some questions here, which you can see we're going to be addressing as we go through this conversation, but there is an opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So please feel free to ask questions as the discussion goes on. I will turn to those questions as we go through this process. So with that, John, I would like to introduce our first question, which is actually to you, the participants. And I'm just watching the numbers climb to make sure we've got a good number of people here. If Lauren, you could launch the poll. We would be very interested before we start to hear from all of you in response to this poll. Which one policy do you think is the best, most impactful policy that we should be or could be implementing to address the challenges of climate change? So what's the best climate policy, in your opinion, from what you know right now? The poll should be launching.
Oh, we're seeing some great responses already, Peter. All right.
Okay, just maybe 10 more seconds for people to pick one of those. And then Lauren, if you would close the poll and show us the results. So maybe this would be a good moment, John, as the results come up, just to hand over to you and really just to get us going here. You know, as we said in our opening slide, that this pandemic is, of course, causing enormous personal suffering and economic hardship both. It's a global phenomenon. And we've seen headlines and analysis that, you know, that the impacts are also cutting our use of fossil fuels and air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. And there's been some speculation that's kind of relevant to the question of how these emissions affect climate change. What do you think about that? You know, from your point of view, what are the similarities and differences between the pandemic and climate change, and you know, what implications are you seeing?
Well, thanks, Peter, and thanks everybody for tuning in. There are many similarities between the COVID pandemic and climate change. First of all, the virus is invisible, and carbon dioxide, the most important greenhouse gas, is invisible. There are long time delays between when you have the virus arrive in your community, when people become infected, when they begin to exhibit symptoms, and then when they can be cleared of the virus. And there are similar long time delays between when we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels and deforesting the world, and when the climate warms up. And so these are difficult issues for folks to grasp. People gather in beaches and bars and houses of worship now thinking everything's fine. Nobody who came in is symptomatic, but that doesn't matter. People can be symptomatic and infectious, or they can be infectious even before they exhibit any symptoms. And of course, there are many asymptomatic cases. And it's the same story with the climate. So those are some of the important similarities. And people have a tough time dealing with complex systems with long time delays. This has been well documented over many, many years. But I think the most important question that you're asking is, is the economic pain that's associated with the lockdown we've all been under, is that the only way we're going to be able to cut our emissions? The emissions reductions during this pandemic period have been dramatic, the largest, fastest ever due to any kind of a crisis. New paper came out just in the last 2 weeks showing that in the first half of April, global CO2 emissions fell by 17%. This is unprecedented. And the benefits of that, people could see the mountains, the air got a lot cleaner. Wildlife started to make its way into our cities and suburbs. The lagoon in Venice was running clear. These are interesting signs that if we can cut our carbon emissions, if we can cut our greenhouse emissions, it's really going to make a lot of benefit for us. The problem is the way we cut those emissions is absolutely not the way we want to do it. It's totally unacceptable to harm the economy in order to just cut our carbon emissions. What we have to do is find a way to do both, to preserve a healthy, prosperous economy with opportunity for everybody while we cut our carbon emissions. So I think anybody who's looking at the pandemic and saying, oh, carbon emissions went down, isn't that terrific? That's a serious error. What we need to do is find those ways to cut our emissions so we can have a healthy, prosperous economy for everyone going forward over many, many years while preserving the economy today.
John, I think that's a very powerful point, and I think maybe surprising to a lot of people, because the environmentalist narrative that we often hear is this tension between economic activity and health and well-being of the planet. So just help reinforce that point of why you think that's not the right way to think about it.
Yeah, so there is a narrative out there, and quite frankly, it's been promoted by the fossil fuel industry, who stand to lose if we build an economy that's carbon-free and preserves a healthy future for everyone. And that narrative says it's growth versus green, it's jobs versus the environment, it's loggers versus spotted owls. I think this is entirely short-sighted and false. It's quite obvious that you can't have a healthy economy if we destroy the environment upon which all life, including human life, depends. And at the same time, you can't have a healthy environment if people are poor and hungry and have no economic opportunity, because desperate people will cut down the last tree to burn for firewood. They'll catch the last fish. They'll eat the seed corn. And everybody on this call, no matter how affluent you are, you would do the same thing too, to preserve and protect your life and those of your loved ones. So there isn't a conflict here. There's a fundamental alignment between a healthy environment, a healthy society, and a healthy economy. That's what we need to focus on. And so just if you hear somebody say, look, we cut emissions and the cost of that was destroying our economy, we can't cut emissions, it's not only logically fallacious, it's empirically wrong, it's morally wrong.
I see. In that reply, I think you were talking in part there about there's an argument around sort of global development and how important that is in relation to the climate challenge that we have. Could we turn also to the question for essentially the developed economies, where there's a parallel question? I think I've heard you talk before about where there are opportunities for job creation and new kinds of jobs and really wealth creation from these sorts of policies.
Absolutely. You know, another part of the let's not do anything about climate narrative, which again, it's largely promoted by the vested interests who stand to lose, and by certain groups and individuals who hate the idea of collective action. And collective action is important here. As with the pandemic, you know, you can't solve the problem of flattening the curve and quenching the pandemic just by individual action. We need collective action. And that's because there's an externality here. When you choose to distance yourself socially, when you support school closures, business closures, sporting event closures, et cetera, you're not just protecting yourself, you're protecting other people. When you wear your mask, you're protecting other people. And when you fail to do those things, you're harming other people. And it's the same with the climate. You burn carbon energy now, you get the private benefit of that. You get to fly around, you get to have all the benefits of being a privileged, affluent person in the developed economy, but you're harming everybody else in the world, including yourself. So we have to have that collective action. And the narrative that comes from those folks who dislike government, who want to undermine the way in our society that we have chosen to act collectively, is a narrative that's putting everybody at risk. The reality is, just as you suggested, that failing to stop climate change is going to harm everybody. The damage, I'm not going to take the time to go into this, but the damage, the harm to our prosperity, our national security, our health, and our lives is nothing short of catastrophic if we don't address this problem. And for everybody, there's not going to be anywhere to hide, no matter how affluent you are. And the other side of that story is that cutting our emissions and replacing the energy services that we need with clean, renewable energy, with energy efficiency and so forth, creates jobs, including everywhere in the world, including in every state of the United States, red and blue. It improves our health by reducing the pollutants that come from burning fossil fuels, not just CO2, but PM 2.5, NOx, SOx, carbon monoxide, ozone, et cetera. These pollutants are killing people today. The WHO estimates that air pollution is causing the premature deaths of about 7 million people every year. And many of those deaths occur in this country. It's not just something that happens in Delhi and Shanghai and Jakarta. So there really isn't a trade-off. There's a huge opportunity here to create good jobs everywhere across this country by aggressively moving to cut our carbon emissions, by replacing the energy that's coming from those harmful sources with solar, with wind, with storage, with geothermal, and especially by promoting energy efficiency.
We often hear that both those things, production and efficiency, are more expensive if we do it in a carbon neutral way. Set aside for a second the question of, what the downstream costs are that we're not accounting for in producing carbon. Are there any great examples that are current that you could give of where
Sure.
that economics actually is counterintuitive?
So the renewables and efficiency are today already now cheaper almost everywhere in the world, including in the United States, unsubsidized, cheaper than the fossil alternatives. So let me just show you a little bit of data real quick. So this is a set of data from Lazard. It shows what's called the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity for various sources. And you can see here in orange, the cost of solar, which has dropped dramatically, 90% over the past 10 years, up through 2019, and became cheaper than coal about 6 years ago. And now it's even cheaper in many places, unsubsidized, than combined cycle gas turbines. And the same is true for wind. It's cheaper. And there's no reason to think that those cost declines from innovation, from learning curves, from scale economies are at an end. So you can you can debate the numbers, but the utilities, who are profit oriented and are not in business to cut climate emissions, they have recognized this. So the most recent example is El Paso Electric, which put out requests for bids from energy producers, and the lowest bids by far were for utility scale solar and solar plus storage. And you can see the data here, 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour for solar and 2.1 per kilowatt hour for solar plus storage. It's cheaper in many places, including in this country now, to design, permit, build, and operate solar and wind facilities than it is to simply operate existing coal, nuclear, and natural gas plants. So the market is telling us clearly that it's cheaper to cut our emissions. That immediately raises the question now of, okay, great, then why don't we just leave it to the market, and then soon we'll just have an entirely green, renewably powered economy. And unfortunately, that's not true, because the fossil industry is still benefiting from enormous subsidies in the form of tax incentives, indemnification, depletion allowances, favorable regulations, and many other subsidies that keep fossil going even after it's harmful economically as well as harmful to the climate. So we still have a need for policies and actions by all the stakeholders here, businesses, individuals, governments, and through international cooperation.
So given the sort of economics, what in your opinion are the impediments here? You know, we hear often about, is it a question of generational equity, the timescales are so long that we can't affect behaviors and decision making either as individuals or for policymakers. Are there any ways that we can help with that?
Yeah, so there are many impediments out there. I have already mentioned regulatory capture of governments at various levels and in various countries by the fossil interests. You mentioned intergenerational equity. Well, the presumption behind that is that the harms from burning carbon today will only show up and hurt our children and our grandchildren. That's just no longer true. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, when the climate alarm was first being sounded, that might have been true. But today, we've already warmed our climate 2 degrees Fahrenheit approximately above pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing significant harm today to economic productivity, through droughts, through flooding, through extreme weather events, increased severity of hurricanes and tropical storms, wildfire events, crop yield declines, rising rates for insurance if you're in a hazard zone of any kind, and so forth. So it's another myth to suggest that climate harm is only later, many decades from now. It's happening now. It's harming and killing people around the world today, and cutting our productivity, reducing our security, and lowering our competitiveness. So it's something we all have to take action on as quickly as possible. And the good news is, many of the things we can do actually help today through job creation, through reducing pollution and improving our health, and improving environmental justice and equity that would particularly help the disadvantaged and those communities, including many communities of color that have historically been discriminated against and systematically not shared in the benefits of economic growth and prosperity.
I mentioned in the introduction that you devote a lot of time to trying to explain and demonstrate these issues to policymakers to really change how policy gets implemented. How do you approach that? These are very complicated arguments.
Right. So, although I love this webinar format, the reality is that just telling people doesn't change anybody's minds. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. So our approach at the MIT Sloan Sustainability Initiative, and working with our partners, Climate Interactive, our approach has been to develop interactive simulations, one of which you see here, that enable people to learn for themselves. And although time is short, let me just quickly show people how it works. I've done a number of briefings here of very senior political leaders, including now collectively, I and my team, we have briefed over 100 members of the Senate and the House of the United States, 7 governors, CEOs and boards of directors, leaders around the world, as well as over 100,000 folks of all professions and backgrounds, from middle school students on up. So, you know, the poll that we asked, if you look at the results of the poll, there's quite a spread. There's many different suggestions people have made. So let's just quickly illustrate how the model works by trying some of your ideas. So the most popular one was to reduce deforestation and increase afforestation. So right here, you're seeing primary energy demand on the left globally and the CO2 emissions that result from that. And the impact of that is that we end up at 4.1 C or 7.3 Fahrenheit of warming by 2100, and we blast through the 2 degrees C, 3.6 Fahrenheit limit before 2050. So in the lifetimes of almost everybody on this call. So what can we do about that? Well, let's try deforestation reduction. That's right here. And you can see as I do it, it's lowering the temperature. The green band here are the emissions from land use, forestry, and agriculture. Let's plant 1 million trees, heavily promoted policy. So that took off 0.2 degrees C. We now have negative emissions from the forest sector, land use sector, but it's no magic bullet. And that's because the carbon removal happens mostly in the out years of the century. So what else did people suggest? Well, invest in R&D to develop methods to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Well, that's a little bit of hoping for technical breakthroughs, but we can try that. And, you know, it helps a little bit. We get more negative emissions, but many of the technologies there actually aren't feasible today or anywhere close to being economically viable. Another suggestion that's fairly common here is to incentivize energy efficiency and electrification. So let's improve the energy efficiency of the transport sector and the buildings and industry sector, residential, commercial, industrial. That matters a lot. There's a lot of energy use in transport and in buildings. The buildings can also be retrofitted. We've now lowered our warming down to 3.4. There's also the suggestion here that we could promote renewables with various incentives. So let's do that. The green wedge of renewables here just got a lot bigger. We're down to 3.3. And people like very much putting a price on carbon emissions. This could be done in ways that are palatable to almost everybody, regardless of your political party. It could be a tax, it could be cap and trade. You could give all the revenue back to the people on an equal per capita basis. Let's see, let's try just $100 a ton here. That's 90 cents on a gallon of gasoline, which would still leave gas prices far below European levels here in the United States. We're down to 2.8. Other great suggestions here, we can electrify the transport sector. Helps now that we've taken the coal largely out of the energy mix. We can electrify the building sector. We're down to 2.5. People also wanted to reduce methane and the other greenhouse gases. And by doing that pretty aggressively, we're down to 2.1. And, you know, we could do some other actions here. People suggested taxing coal. We already have a carbon tax. Let's try really fast. Let's stop building all new coal infrastructure by 2025. Well, there you go. 2 degrees, 3.6 Fahrenheit. We've met the Paris targets. We've created a much safer world. And what you notice is that there's no one thing. There's no silver bullet. But there is silver buckshot here, and it is still, with a little bit of luck, technically possible, engineering possible, and quite affordable to do every one of these things. And along the way, you'll be creating a lot of jobs, including in communities all across the country with energy efficiency, renewables, forest stewardship, etc., and improving people's health. By the way, this model is freely available for everybody. what I'm going to do here, and when you use it, you can, tweet out or share on social media your scenario. I'll copy the link and put it in the chat, and we'll push it out to all of you. If you click on that link, you will go right to that scenario, and then you can build your own, because that's the only way people are going to learn. Try it yourself.
Great, great. This is clearly a very usable tool, so we absolutely encourage everyone to follow that link that John is posting, and we'll share that after the webinar as well. This is a great opportunity also, John, to bring in, we had so many questions, you can't possibly address them, but one that seems quite relevant here, theme was, what are we learning from this blip that we're seeing with COVID and CO2 emissions and so forth? And how can a model like this help sort of put into perspective what we're learning from that?
Well, what I hope we're learning from the pandemic, and I've been working on this with colleagues quite a bit, is, first of all, the science matters. Doesn't matter what your political ideology is. We have to pay attention to the science. What the model indicates and what the research shows is that just telling people the science doesn't work. And this has been a problem in the pandemic. You hear not only conflicting opinions, but you hear scientists telling you what you ought to do, and doesn't stop people from gathering without masks in close quarters, because they don't get the immediate consequences of that action due to the time delays. So models like this help people experience what would happen if, and in a way that we hope, and the evidence suggests does, help people not only learn more, but feel the urgency of this problem. And it's that affect, it's that emotional response that our studies show drive people's actions in the real world to get politically engaged on climate, to make changes in the way they live, and to push for the collective action we need to keep the fossil carbon in the ground.
On that last point about learning more, thank you. I think you pulled together on one last slide some resources.
Right. So
interesting to people who may like to learn more about.
I want to make sure everybody can follow up after today's session. So there's a variety of ways folks can do that. You can access the model I just showed you freely at the web link here, n-roads.org. And then we have a variety of exec ed programs where we go into depth on how to do the kind of systems thinking integrated approach to policy design and implementation that we've been talking about here today.
Thank you, John. And we're just about out of time. So it remains for me to once again thank you, John Sterman, for taking this time with the exec ed community today. Thank you all out there for signing in and sitting at your screen for 30 extra minutes on this day as well. This obviously is an incredibly important topic, every bit as important as the immediate pandemic crisis that we're facing. And we hope that this has been informative and inspiring. I certainly feel inspired by the work that you're doing, John, and makes me optimistic that we will be able to address these challenges.
Thank you very much.